Hello, and welcome to Code Pro, your source for helpful and effective programming tutorials. Today we're going to be continuing our iOS tutorial series covering UITableViewDelegate and how to pass data between view controllers. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to build today. In my simulator here, I have a little application with a table view, some data in there, and each cell responds to a user tap, and then we'll take you to a DetailViewController. So we can click the second one and see the name for that cell, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and dive into our learning objectives for this lesson. We are going to learn how to respond to when a user taps on table cells. We're going to learn how to change the table cell row height, investigate and understand some of the basic concepts of UITableViewDelegate, how to group code functionality using extensions in Swift, and then how to pass data from one view controller to another without having to use prepare for segue. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Go ahead and open Xcode and create a new iOS single view application. And let's start in the storyboard getting set up with our view controller with the table view and our detail view controller. So I am going to, first of all, add our detail view controller. So I'm going to go to the object library and drag a view controller onto the canvas. And I am going to create a new Swift file. And we're going to subclass this second view controller. So I am going to call this DetailViewController. And create the file. And we'll go ahead and import UIKit, which contains all the information for UIViewController, and class DetailViewController, which inherits from UIViewController. And let's just go ahead and override our viewDidLoad, which is our starting point for this view controller, super.viewDidLoad. Okay. Now, let's go back into the storyboard and go ahead and add a label. Well, first of all, let's subclass this view controller. So go into the class inspector, go under class, and now type in DetailViewController. And let's also do the same thing for our storyboard ID, because we're going to use that to locate this view controller and then navigate to it. We're also going to add a label to it. Right in the center. This is what is going to display the detail value for when a user clicks on a row in the cell. So we'll just go ahead and drag this and kind of center it. And we can go over in our attribute inspector here and center the text in the label. And I am just going to add some basic auto layout constraints. You can use the guidelines to find the center point of the view controller, which is that point for me. Go over to resolve auto layout issues and reset to suggested constraints. Usually gets the layout right most of the time. And let's go ahead and make our bindings for this label to our view controller, our detail view controller. So open the assistant editor, and you'll have your detail view controller on the right, your storyboard on the other side, and select your label in the document outline. Hold down the control key, click and drag, and create a new IB outlet to your detail view controller. I'm just going to call this DetailLabel. And sometimes Xcode needs to be clean, so you can do Command-Shift-K if it can't find the connection. Xcode is very buggy, and Xcode 8 really buggy. Again, hold down the control key, click and drag, and we'll try again. Detail text or detail label, connect, and there we go. So connection has been made successfully. We're also going to add one more property to this view controller, and I'll explain it when we get to it. But we're going to create an optional string, so we'll just call this var detail text string and optional. And this will become important once we are passing data from one view controller to the other. So for right now, we're good here. Let's go back over into our initial view controller and add our table view and start getting that set up. So we're going to get out of the assistant editor and go back into the standard editor. Let's go ahead and select our view controller. And let's go ahead and go over to the object library. And you'll notice we're not using a table view controller this time. That would simplify some things, but for the sake of learning UITableViewDelegate, it's more beneficial to actually implement the table view inside of a UI view controller instead, which is what we're doing in this tutorial. So type table view and drag back a table view itself, not a view controller, not table view controller, but table view, and we'll drag that onto our view controller. And let's just go ahead and get this centered. And we'll just pin it to the edges here. And we're going to add some constraints for this. We should be able to do the same thing. Resolve auto layout issues and reset to suggested constraints. That should work for us. And we also need to add a table view cell, which we also have to select here. So you can see right below table view, there's table view cell. So drag a cell onto our table view. And now our cell has been set up. And again, table view controller does this for us, but using a view controller, a UI view controller, will have to do this manually like we just did. So let's go ahead and set an identifier for our table view cell. So select your cell in the document outline, go over to the attribute inspector, and for the identifier, I'm going to use cell. You can name it whatever you desire. And let's go ahead and we are going to subclass this cell. So go back over to your code directory and let's create a new Swift file. I'm going to call mine custom cell. And let's go ahead and set this class up. I'm going to import UIKit, which contains all of the information for UITableViewCell. And we'll call this class custom cell, which inherits from UITableViewCell. And let's go ahead now, and we need to create one more binding here, or two more bindings I should say. We need to add a label to this cell because we're going to bind our data for each row to it. So look for a UI label in the object library, and we'll drag that right onto the cell. Try to center that, and drag all the way over to the guidelines on the right side. And select your label. We'll go over to the auto layout issue resolver, reset to suggested constraints, and I am just going to go ahead and remove the default text that gets injected into this label. Okay, so one thing we still need to do is we need to subclass this cell with the new custom cell we just created. So select the cell, go over to the class library, and see the class here. Go ahead and type custom cell to create that subclass. And now we need to create two more outlets. So let's go ahead and go back into our assistant editor. Let's go ahead and get the storyboard on one side and the custom cell on the other side. Select that label that you just added, hold down the control key, click and drag, and we'll just go ahead and make an outlet calling this cell label. And if Xcode complains, just go ahead, Command-Shift-K to clean the project, and try again. Control, click and drag, cell label. There we go. Okay, now keep the assistant editor open, and we need to go ahead and find View Controller. And right here, we need to create an IB outlet for our table view. So in our View Controller document outline, go up the hierarchy and select Table View. Hold down the Control key, click and drag, and let's make a new connection in View Controller, and we'll just go ahead and call this Table View. Okay, so now we are pretty much set up and ready to get coding here. I'm just going to go ahead and change the cell's background color to something different. So if you go under your cell and you go into Content View, if you go into the Attribute Inspector, you can change that background color. I'll just go ahead and use red for mine, just something a little different. I'm also going to change my text for the cell label to white so it's a little easier to read. Okay, so now we need to go ahead and start implementing our TableViewDelegate and data source or methods. So the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to create an extension, two separate extensions. One extension on ViewController for TableViewDelegate, one extension on ViewController for TableViewDataSource. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and create a little simple data source right here. This will be what's going to feed our table. So let data source equal Max, John, Alex, and Sarah. So now we have our data source array set up. Let's go ahead and create those extensions. We'll start off with UITableViewDataSource. So what we'll do here is create a mark TableViewDataSource, and we'll create our extension on our class, which our class is named ViewController. So we are extending functionality here, and we are extending UITableViewDataSource. Now we've looked at this before. We know that there are two mandatory methods that we absolutely have to implement, one being self-row at index path and one being number of rows in section. So I'm going to go ahead and implement those now. A number of rows in section is going to return the count of the items in our data source. And now we need to implement cell for row at index path. And let me go ahead and get out of the assistant editor so this is a little easier for you guys to read. Back into ViewController. Okay. So let's go ahead and grab our cell. Let cell equals TableView dot DQ, reusable cell with identifier. The identifier that we set in Interface Builder was cell. We set that on our cell if you remember back when we added that to the attribute inspector. And we will cast this as custom cell, which is a TableView cell. And then we will return it. And one thing we have to remember to do is set the label on the cell. So cell dot cell label, which is the outlet that we created, dot text equals data source at index path dot row, which will bind each string in our data source array to each row of our table view. So that's what's happening right here. So this completes the implementation for UITableViewDataSource. But now we need to take a look at UITableViewDelegate, which has some very important functionality that every iOS developer needs to understand. So TableViewDelegate, and we'll create another extension. And the whole point of the extensions is to keep our code nice, modular, and organized. If you open up your list of methods here, you can see that we have our ViewController class. We have all of our associated functionality with ViewController, with TableViewDataSource, and we will then have our associated functionality for TableViewDelegate. Everything is nice and modular. It's not all clumped together in one class. It keeps things clean, organized. It's a best practice for using it in Swift, and that's why we are doing it in this tutorial. So let's go ahead and look inside of TableViewDelegate here. If you command click, we can actually go into this protocol and take a look at the methods here. And you'll notice that there's lots of methods for interacting with cells, for will display header view and did end displaying header view. Height for row at index path, lots of, and if you, everything in here is marked optional. We don't have to implement it, but if we want to manipulate the cell in any way, a lot of these methods are available for us to use to do a lot of those kinds of manipulations and modifications on cells. So it's a really good idea to take a look in this protocol and see what's available. The two big ones that we're going to be using are did select row at index path and height for row at index path. So what do these two methods do? The height for row is pretty self-explanatory. It requires to return a float or CG float back, and it's going to dictate the height or how tall each cell is going to be. I'm going to go ahead and return 100, but it's important to realize that you can change this value on the table view in Interface Builder, but if you override this method and return a value, the cell height will be whatever you return from this override. So if you plan on just using Interface Builder, you would not want to implement this. If you want to implement this in code, the cell height will match the number returned here. So anytime we tap a cell, we are going to get a call here to did select a row. It'll give us a table view and then the index path for the selected row. So what we are going to do at this point is find our DetailViewController, pass data to it, and then we'll go ahead and push it. So before we do that, there's one more thing I want to do here, because I want to use a navigation controller. So what I'm going to do is go back into Storyboard one final time, select our view controller, go under Editor, embed in Navigation Controller. So let's go ahead and pop back over here. And now let's go back into our view controller and let's go ahead and start working on this. So we are going to let detail VC equals storyboard dot instantiate view controller with identifier, and we're going to use detail view controller as detail view controller, and we are going to then push this detail view controller onto our navigation stack, like so. Navigation controller dot push view controller detail VC animated set to true. And let me just take one more look and make sure that we set something correctly on our detail view controller. Okay, we are good there. And so what's going to happen is when we tap a row, we're going to instantiate our detail view controller and then push it onto the stack. If you remember, navigation controller is an optional property on every UI view controller. And any UI view controller that you embed in a navigation controller, like we just did, will have this property available and have a navigation controller that you can push and pop view controllers to and from. But we still need to pass the data, which we'll go ahead and do right now. So detail VC dot detail text, which is our optional string that we binded on the detail view controller, equals data source at index path dot row. And you'll notice here, well, okay, why couldn't we just go ahead and use the label that we added? Remember, if you take a look, dot detail, we have a UI label, detail label, and we have detail text marked optional. So what would happen if we went ahead and decided to bind our string value to this label right here? We'd have a runtime crash. The reason is viewDidLoad is not called, and these bindings are not yet available at this point in the life cycle. So what we need to do is we need to go into our detail view controller, and we need to actually go into viewDidLoad, and we need to set that here. So what we want to do is say the label that we made the binding to, detail label, dot text, which is optional, equals detail text, which is also optional. So if we forget to set this in the main view controller, but still call this in viewDidLoad, there won't be any problem. They're both optional properties. There will be no crash. This will be handled just fine. But if we tried to set it here, we would have a crash. And it's very important to make that distinction. This has not been loaded yet until it's been pushed onto the stack, and then its view loaded in ViewDidLoad, upon which you can then go ahead and do the binding. And one more thing we need to remember to do is, since we're not using a table view controller, we need to set the table view's data source and delegate equal to self. And why is that? Because this view controller is implementing UITableViewDelegate and UITableViewDataSource. So we need to explicitly set that as follows. Table view dot delegate equals self and table view dot data source equals self. Now everything should work. And if you forget to do these steps, you'll be looking at an empty table view and you'll have no idea what's going on. And it's 90% of the time you forgot to set the delegate and the data source manually. So let's go ahead and run this. I'm going to go ahead and use my iPhone 5S simulator here. So let's fire this up. That's the old one here. Let's give it a second to transfer to the new app. Okay, so our data is loaded just fine. If I select a cell, we go to the detail view with the appropriate label, go back. Let's try John. John on the detail view, go back. Alex. Alex shows up in the detail view, and so we're all set. So that covers the basics of this tutorial and covers all of our learning objectives. Table views are very used in iOS development. It's what I would say the bread and butter for mobile apps. You'll see them used everywhere. So getting a better understanding of how to use them to your benefit is very, very important. So thank you for stopping by. Please like the video if you liked it and subscribe for more future tutorials. You can follow CodePro on Twitter and on Facebook. The links are in the description. You can find the code available on GitHub. That link is also in the description. And also go ahead and check us out on Patreon. It always helps. And thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.